Well, let's start by talking about this. This is a concept that is an interesting one. I think Kelly Brownell and others wrote a very good paper a couple of months ago about strategic research and talked about how strategic research was research that systematically links research to policy. But the science always has to come first. It can't be policy-driven science. It has to always be science-driven policy. It's not reverse engineering. But this concept of knowing your outcome, Kristen, you call it destination, I call it outcome, also needs to be always thought of, even for those of us who are in academia and who really don't do much of our research in the regulatory or policy arenas. So what I'd like to do is to lay this out for starters, talking about research intentions. And I think many of us in this audience are in the first column up there, the academic research, where what we're trying to do is enhance fundamental knowledge and understandings of mechanisms of action or effects. And then there are the policy people who are here too, who are interested in program operations and education or information, and then regulatory, safety, claims, composition of products, and so forth. So the intentions vary. The quality and the validity and so forth remain the same. But let's focus on academic research, because this is what I know the most about, and that's what I've done most of my life. Our goal is to try to make sure things are true and significant. We publish a lot of papers and we give talks and posters. Our incentives are professional recognition and advancement and fundamental understanding, and our accountability is chiefly to our peers. We use peer review to try to make sure that what we're doing is good, and we have standards, of course, fraud and ethics, no misrepresentation and so forth, and we also use statistics. And this is common to many other kinds of research. Here is a faceless bureaucrat, and I'm going to have a faced bureaucrat in a while to show you. But policy research, I think, is different in a couple of ways, and this comes from Jasanoff's book called The Fifth Branch, which she's over at the Kennedy School and has written a very good book on this. But basically, for policy, it's truth relevant to policy, so you've got to think of the policy. Product decisions and explanations, incentives, guidance for decision makers, accountability, a lot of different accountability, because it's not only to Congress, but to courts, to the media, professional community, industry, and other stakeholders, as well as consumers. And the procedures here are evidence review, and Tricia will be talking about that, at least one form of evidence review, committees of experts, and agency reviews. And all of these, of course, are very much involved in the dietary guidelines and other kinds of policy statements. The standards have to do with utility for programs, lack of fraud, misrepresentation, synchrony with other agency policies and guidance, and history. And many of you in this audience have had a lot of policy experience, and I hope you pipe up. Then there's regulatory research, and this is what Jasanoff's book's mostly about. The goal here is truth relevant to a law or a regulation. And the focus here is on decisions and regulations, and the incentives are compliance with legal requirements, and the accountability, again, is to Congress and to courts, as well as the media and other groups. The procedures here, again, are a little bit different, and most of us in academia are not used to audits. We're used to site visits, but not regulatory and judicial review. And the standards, again, in many cases are the same: lack of fraud, misrepresentation, but also conformity to agency protocols and legal tests, and the whole issue of preponderance of evidence and so forth. So we have a lot of similarities, and we're going to try to explore them today, but there are also some differences. But the point is, to focus on outcome is really essential to decide on the path you're going to take. So if you don't know where you're going, then it doesn't matter what path you take. But if you want your research findings to be translated, and in all cases that isn't true, but in many cases it is, then we really think that we have to ask a relevant question and understand how the research is going to be evaluated in the end. Well, now to systematic reviews and why the handout. Systematic reviews are the basis for a lot of decision making, and some of the many groups that use systematic reviews are listed on this slide. I think you're familiar with the first three. The European Food Safety Authority is sort of like our FDA. Dietary reference intakes over at the Academy. And then virtually all high-impact journals are now using systematic reviews as one of the major sources of information. Let's just turn to the policy issue. I know you all know about the academic research. So focusing on policy, there are several things we need to think about. One is knowing the relevant research question. And on the slide, we've shown an example. I think it's from the 2015 Dietary Guidelines. These are one of the unanswered questions that the committee came up with that needed to be answered and couldn't be answered with the data available. Secondly, describe what you've tested in terms of not only in nutrients but also in food terms and feasibility of the intervention. And then the relevant population. If you're focusing on the general public, don't take a bunch of people in a hospital. In terms of the regulatory issues, there's wonderful guidance that the Food and Drug Administration put out now about 5 years ago. And it's really worth not only people who are doing regulatory work or planning on having the regulatory target, but it's really good for academic researchers too. So the same principles govern all of these activities regardless of the end. In the 2004, I think it was, volume where the Food and Nutrition Board looked back on the DRI process, this diagram was one of the things that they mentioned. And the basic point on the regulatory aspects is that the toxicological approach, which Deanne will talk about, and I think others, maybe Bill, for nutrient risk assessment is difficult for chronic disease outcomes. And there are several reasons for that, but if you go to that volume, it really outlines them in detail. Some of the problems that were found in the DRI process were that there were 19 nutrients where the outcome was chronic disease, and none of them had enough information in 1994 when the process started for an EAR. And it ended up that only 4 nutrients, one was fluoride, I think, and a couple of others, fluoride and caries, ended up with adequate intakes for chronic disease outcomes. So there's a lot of work if we're going to be looking at chronic disease outcomes. Two of the major problems that the committee identified in the volume that's over on your right were exposure issues, errors in intake and lack of databases that were good enough, and then a whole bunch of things related to hazards such as lack of dose response data, data not available for key event that was causing the critical adverse effect, mode of action wasn't known, and a whole bunch of other problems. So there's plenty of us in all of the 3 domains we'll be talking about today to deal with. So we urge you to, you always are asking good questions, but to ask a relevant question, making sure if we're in academe that we're dealing with causal inference and criteria of study, and also looking at where we want to target the research in the end. For policy, we'll have illustrations here of the dietary guideline evidence review process, and the IOM process will probably come up too. And then regulatory, we'll be talking a little about FDA guidance and EFSA and other regulatory processes. So we look forward to thinking about that triangle of policy, regulatory, academic research as being unified by many of the same concepts. And finally, designing your study to meet relevant reporting criteria is also important. And there are many different templates that can be used to check whether your study is going to meet the evaluation criteria that it will finally be judged by. And you know about STROBE for observational studies and CONSORT for randomized clinical trials, and a whole bunch of others that we've put into the insert. So know where you want to go before you get going, and we're going to try to talk a little bit about that, explore some areas that at least I was unfamiliar with until I got a chance to interact with our speakers. And just remember that for strategic research that's going to translate into impact, we all need to consider validity and impact and feasibility and the outcome upfront, and not only in design but analysis and then in reporting. So that's where we're headed.